In this 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, scholars are busy writing about foreign policy. They're busy writing about the Declaration, I'm sorry. And they should be writing about it, but what I've seen so far mostly concerns domestic policy. People are interested in things like race, sex, class, and justice, the subject matter of my book, Vindicating the Founders, which is fine, but scholars typically, I think, neglect the link between foreign policy and the principles of the Declaration. And many assume that the Declaration contains no foreign policy principles at all. It's a pretty common view. Or if they do touch on the Declaration's principles, they are likely to claim that as soon as America became a major power, that led directly to today's so-called rules-based international order within which America strives to impose its version of liberalism on the whole world. Stephen Walt, a Harvard international relations scholar, writes, quote, "John Quincy Adams may have recognized that the early republic was too weak to go out in search of monsters to destroy, but the temptation to spread liberal ideals became more alluring as the United States grew stronger. Once the country stood at the pinnacle of power, it was impossible to resist." So says Stephen Walt. On the contrary, I will show that the founders' principles directly oppose today's American-led liberal hegemony. To respond to this common modern error, I will restate the political theory of the Declaration and then turn to its bearing on foreign policy. As I proceed, I will show that the Constitution shows plenty of evidence that its principles of foreign policy, insofar as they're visible there, are the same as those of the Declaration. So, to begin with, all men are created equal, or in the Virginia Bill of Rights, all men are by nature equally free and independent. From that equal natural liberty, which of course includes life as presupposed by liberty, specific rights and duties follow. First, in the Declaration, all human beings everywhere are endowed with inalienable rights. Second, all are equally bound to respect those rights in others. In the founders' language, the laws of nature and of nature's God are both the source of their rights and establish moral limits on the exercise of those rights. Liberty is not license. All have a right to liberty, but no one has a right to take liberty away from another by ruling him without his consent. And I'll add here very quickly, it's a very common theme among contemporary conservative critics of the founding, to claim, and I'll quote Patrick Deneen, according to the founders, it's all rights and no duties. And what I'm saying is quite the opposite. Yes, rights, but rights are ultimately grounded in the laws of nature. Now, we need government because in a state of nature outside of government, our rights are insecure and our duties are not enforced. Hamilton explains in The Federalist this way: why has government been instituted at all? Because the passions of men will not conform to the dictates of reason and justice without constraint. Madison adds in a later Federalist, in a state of nature, the weaker individual is not secured against the violence of the stronger. It follows, as the Declaration says, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Why consent? If we are born free, then free consent alone can be the basis of the just powers of government. But who is doing the consenting? The rights of mankind belong to all men everywhere. But the consenters are only those who, as it were, secede from the rest of the human race and choose to subject themselves to a particular government. The 1780 Massachusetts Constitution, if only they still believed in it in Massachusetts, explains the body politic is formed by a voluntary association of individuals. It is a social compact by which the whole people covenants with each citizen, and each citizen with the whole people, that all shall be governed by certain laws for the common good. The compact is for citizens only. No one else can claim membership in a particular political society, and therefore, no one else can claim protection from that society. This argument alone is enough to refute those scholars who imagine that the Founders' Principles authorized the U.S. to intervene around the world on behalf of the rights of people who are not American citizens. Now, the Constitution does not include these theoretical arguments. Such reasonings, as Hamilton sarcastically observed in Federalist 84, sound much better in a treatise of ethics than in a constitution of government. Still, several provisions of the Constitution manifest the Declaration's two criteria of good government. First, consent. It is we the people who authorize the Constitution. It is the people of each state who elect the House of Representatives, and the federal government guarantees to each state a Republican form of government. Second criterion of the Declaration, securing rights. Here it would be tedious and unnecessary for my purposes to list all the Constitution's clauses that aim at that purpose. One might even say the entire Constitution is about a structure of government that's meant to secure the life, liberty, and property of the citizen. I turn now to foreign policy specifically. The Declaration of Independence does not describe the distinctive roles of foreign and domestic policy in securing our rights. Here, again, the Massachusetts Constitution preamble is very helpful. It clarifies government-specific duties in these two areas. Government's first task, which Massachusetts states as the sole purpose of foreign policy, is, quote, to secure the existence of the body politic and to protect it, unquote. This is immediately followed by a statement of government's sole domestic policy task, which is, quote, to furnish the individuals who compose it with the power of enjoying their natural rights and the blessings of life, unquote. So the first task, the protection of the society's very being from external violence, is obviously the condition for the second but more important task, namely the protection of life, liberty, and property against harm from other citizens, most importantly, by means of the criminal and the civil law, to enable them to enjoy the blessings of life. The Declaration itself portrays the existential importance of foreign policy in its complaints against the King of Britain. He has declared us, quote, out of his protection and is waging war against us. He has burnt our towns and destroyed the lives of our people. So our towns, our property, the lives of our people, right? Life, so property, life. He has constrained our fellow citizens to bear arms against their country. That's their liberty. So all three, right? Property, life, liberty, attacked, denied by the British king. That's and violating, in fact, reversing the fundamental purpose of government, which is to protect all three. By treating us, and the parallel in the US Constitution is found in the preamble, which also affirms these two foreign and domestic policy duties of government, but in more diffuse language. To establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. So, just as in Massachusetts, the common defense is a condition for the people's enjoying the blessings of liberty, which would then be provided through justice, which means reliable law enforcement, tranquility, which also reliable law enforcement, and the general welfare, just the general statement of what the intention is, the public good. And all this is for citizens only, right? Ourselves and our posterity, not for people elsewhere in the world. Several clauses of the US Constitution confirm the limitation of foreign policy to national defense. In fact, whenever a foreign policy purpose is mentioned in the Constitution, it always concerns defense. For example, the state militias may be called into national service, but only to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions, right? So the only foreign policy use permitted is repel invasions. Further, the Constitution states, no state shall engage in war unless actually invaded or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay. Again, defense. Finally, the sole explicit foreign policy duty of the federal government to the states is to protect each one of them against invasion. Also a quote. Of course, the framers of the Constitution did not expect all future wars to be invasions fought on American soil. The federal government, for example, is given the power to punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas. So in other words, government's task, which is limited to protecting American lives and commerce, sometimes requires actions outside the homeland. One can think easily, an easy example, the Barbary Wars of the early 19th century fought to defend American commerce against piracy in the Mediterranean. As for war, just war, in the founders' conception, is a necessary, if regrettable, instrument of national policy to deter or resist attack. As the Declaration of Independence says, independent nations, quote, have full power to levy war, unquote. The Massachusetts Constitution, describing the need for a state militia, explains that the governor must be ready, quote, to assemble in martial array, put in warlike posture, the inhabitants thereof, and to kill and conquer such person or persons as shall attempt the destruction, invasion, detriment, or annoyance of this Commonwealth. Congress, John Adams loved, who was the author of he loved piling up the adjectives, right? Or the verbs in this, or the nouns in this case. Congress likewise has the power to declare war in the common defense, and the president conducts war by his power as commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Now, you might say, why are you talking about war? That's obvious. Obviously, war is sometimes needed. But starting with Woodrow Wilson in 1917, in his war message to Congress, there has been a consistent rejection of war as a policy that serves the particular interest of the United States or any other particular nation. As Wilson said in his war message, our object in this war is not, in World War I, not to defend ourselves as a nation, but rather to vindicate the principles of peace and justice in the life of the world against selfish and autocratic power. So in other words, war only is allowed on behalf of the peace and justice in the life of the world, not on behalf of a particular nation's own defense. Our goal, Wilson says, is, quote, for a universal dominion of right, unquote. In 1928, following Wilson's lead, the U.S., as a signatory of the Kellogg-Briand Pact, pledged never again to engage in war as an instrument of national policy. Interestingly, Coolidge, who was regarded as a huge conservative, therefore anti-Wilson, totally on board with Wilson's view here. Only wars fought as an instrument of international policy, namely wars to end war, are permitted. The same view has been frequently reaffirmed by the United Nations and other international bodies ever since. The founders, of course, would have been baffled by such an absurdity. As Hamilton said, only a man far gone in utopian expectations could engage in such a deceitful dream of a golden age, unquote. Now, in war, success depends on arms, and arms depend on national wealth. And there are multiple provisions in the federal Constitution concerning the federal government's duty to engage in war and to acquire arms. So it's raise and support armies, provide and maintain a navy, erect forts, magazines, and arsenals, and so on. But arms and armed forces are expensive. So what is implied then is a duty of government to promote the economic independence and well-being of the nation. For this reason, in one of its first acts, the House of Representatives in 1790 asked Hamilton, who was then Secretary of the Treasury, for a report on the encouragement and promotion of such manufactories as will tend to render the United States independent of other nations for essential and particularly for military supplies. And this report ended up leading to, among other things, the idea of protective tariffs to encourage American industry to develop and not be undercut, undersold by at that time, what was more efficient British industry. Similarly, the Constitution it also provides for peace, right? Not just war. So there will be a need for making treaties, receiving ambassadors from other nations, and so on. So there's the war and there's the peace side, and we'll talk in a second about how they understood peace to be the normal and the normal condition of the nation that is going forward. But I turn to the question of sovereignty at this point, national sovereignty. Now, what I mean by that is that to protect the nation as the purpose of foreign policy is not just the defense of its physical existence through war and arms and diplomacy and so on, but also defense of its government from foreign influence and foreign control. It must maintain its sovereignty in the sense of being completely free to act by itself, on its own, to secure the rights of the people. There are good practical reasons to secure the independence, freedom of action of the government. Washington's farewell address famously warns that political or military alliances are dangerous because they create limits on a nation's sovereignty, its freedom of action. A military alliance typically requires one country to come to the aid of another in case of war. If that happens, the nation loses, to that extent, control over its own policy, its own fate. And as Washington says, nations never have the same interests. So at that point, the United States is going to be serving the interest of another nation. In the Declaration, the statement is made, quote, "Only as free and independent states do nations have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances." Full power, right? You have to be independent to have full power. To the extent to which you're dependent on another nation, you have less than full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and so on. And so Washington advises, on the basis of this idea, that the great rule of conduct for us, the United States, in regard to foreign nations, is in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible. He's saying we should have as much commerce as we can with other nations and as little political connection as possible with other nations to maintain our freedom of action and build our national wealth, is what he had in mind. America is an example of the problem of sovereignty. America had made a military alliance with France at a desperate moment in the Revolutionary War. Without French help, the revolution might not have succeeded. They had to do it. But that help came at a cost. There was a French treaty, and in that treaty, it seemed to require the United States to join France if there was a case of war between France and Britain. And there was a big debate in the cabinet of Washington about that. Should we not join the French in a war against Britain? They agreed with Washington that no, we're going to stay out, and Washington issued his neutrality proclamation, keeping America out of that French-British war, but not without considerable complaining and a lot of soul-searching about whether, in fact, America was breaking its treaty with France. A renewed war with Britain in the 1790s could have been disastrous, given America's weak condition at that time. And I think Washington knew that, and even Jefferson and Hamilton knew we have to find a way to not get involved. These are practical considerations, and they're well known. But what is not as well understood is that sovereign freedom of action is not only a practical necessity for conducting a foreign policy that is wholly devoted to American rights. Sovereignty is also a requirement of the founders' theory of consent as the only legitimate basis of government. The United States, says the Declaration, are ready to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. The logic behind this is as follows. Composed of previously free individuals who are now citizens, the United States have a right to retain the original freedom of its members by acting as a free and independent state with a separate and equal station that must now be respected by Britain and by all other nations without leave or hindrance. Right, so you're born free as individuals, you join the political society as a free citizen. Collectively, you as a collection of citizens who are represented by the government have the same freedom as you have as individuals in a state of nature. Thus, that's where the requirement of the laws of nature protecting the separate and equal station of the individual nation is coming from. In the US Constitution, there is an affirmation of this same founder's conception of national sovereignty in the following way. You can see it in the following sense. It's not stated in that language, but what is clear is that all foreign policy powers in the Constitution are placed in the hands of Congress and the President and no one else. Right? There is simply no source of policy outside the US. So there's no way that other nations, others that could be involved. In other words, the founders' principles, and not just prudential considerations, require the rejection of what is today called multilateralism, and that is the partial outsourcing of a nation's foreign policy to other nations or to international organizations through permanent alliances such as NATO, now almost 80 years old. The right of maintaining so that's so much for national sovereignty. But what I want to add now is the right of maintaining sovereignty is accompanied by a duty to other nations on the same basis. So just as Britain must now recognize and respect the separate and equal station of the United States, so also the United States must recognize Britain and all other countries as independent nations. What follows are two corollaries. First, non-intervention, and second, neutrality. First, the duty of non-intervention in other nations' internal affairs. It follows from this line of reasoning about sovereignty, the right of every nation to be sovereign and to be treated as a free and equal nation in respect to all other nations. It follows from that line of reasoning that neutrality is generally the correct policy in foreign relations. And secondly, the duty of non-interference in other nations' wars and foreign policies follows. So you have the two, right? Neutrality with respect to other nations' wars and non-intervention in respect to other nations' internal policies. The only exception would be if another nation threatens or harms America's people, territory, or government. The Declaration sums up the proper understanding of America's relations with other nations in this phrase, quote, "Enemies in war, in peace, friends," unquote. In other words, as long as you are not attacking us, we will treat you as friends, even if we believe your government fails to protect the liberties of your own subjects. No imperialism is allowed, no ruling other nations without their consent, however well-meaning. You may have heard of the policy of R2P. The UN, while Clinton was president, the United Nations promulgated a policy of responsibility to protect. Every nation has the responsibility to protect its own citizens from violence and harm. And the presumption and what is behind that is the idea that nations outside those nations that are oppressing their own citizens have a responsibility to intervene and protect against genocide. That was the initial reason why we went to war against Libya. Obama said they're about to massacre a large number of citizens, and so we have to go in there and attack the government of Libya. And this non-intervention principle that I'm talking about, well understood in the founding and really unobjective, really not controversial. So let me take Hamilton and Jefferson. Hamilton writes that the French declare that they will grant fraternity and assistance to every people who wish to recover their liberty. So he's writing in 1793. Right, the French Revolution has reached its peak. It's going crazy. They're murdering people in Paris. And they're expanding their revolutionary army all over Europe. And Hamilton's comment on this is, this extraordinary decree amounted exactly to an interference by one nation in the internal government of another. This decree was little short of a declaration of war against all nations having princes and privileged classes, end quote. Jefferson also denounced the French at the same time for, quote, endeavoring to force liberty upon their neighbors in their own form, unquote. So again, left Jefferson and Madison frequently treated as if they are at odds in the 1790s, not on this point. Interventionism is always a violation of the law of nations. The Monroe Doctrine, which came later, renounced as a matter of settled policy any idea that America would involve itself in European affairs as long as any Europeans were no threat to us. Monroe's formulation was, whatever government exists de facto in Europe, we will regard as the government de jure. The founders would therefore have emphatically disagreed with Theodore Roosevelt and other 20th century progressives who believed America has a general world duty to see the neighboring countries stable, orderly, and prosperous. That is because, says TR, every nation, whether in America or anywhere else, so it wasn't just the American, not just the Western Hemisphere, but the whole world, any nation, whether in America or anywhere else, which desires to maintain its freedom, its independence, must ultimately realize that the right of such independence cannot be separated from the responsibility of making good use of it. Right, so in other words, no nation has the right to its own sovereignty anymore, according to Roosevelt. All is contingent on whether the nation is well governed or not. Summing up what I've said so far in a very broad way, the founders would be called nationalists in today's use of that term. They prioritized the American nation. They did not believe that the social compact authorizes government to concern itself with the internal affairs of other nations. Nor was government authorized to interfere in the wars of other nations as long as those wars did not threaten or harm America. It was America first all the way. I turn now to the topic of the law of nations. And in this case, you might think I'm burying the lead because this turns out to be an actual connection between the constitutional text and the principles of the Declaration. In Article 1, Congress is given the power to define and punish offenses against the law of nations. The law of nations was then understood as a legal term of art that refers directly to the founders' social compact theory, theory of natural rights, human equality, etc. And in this clause, the law of nations is taken to be so authoritative that Congress needs to make laws to enforce it. Today, this clause is little noticed and much misunderstood. I'll take a typical modern scholar, Eugene Kantorovich, who writes, quote, "The term law of nations is synonymous with what today is called customary international law," unquote. These rules, he continues, Kantorovich continues, are created not by treaty, but by the general consent and practice of states through their mutual dealings. In other words, for Kantorovich, the law of nations in today's view is wholly conventional. And that was not the founders' view. The authorities that the founders most often consulted argued that the law of nations is grounded in the law of nature. Blackstone's Commentaries was the most quoted book on politics in America in the 1790s. He explains that the law of nations has two sources. First, the rules of natural law, and second, mutual compacts, treaties, leagues, and agreements between nations. So that's Blackstone. And the second part of the second source, compacts, treaties, leagues, and agreements, that's what Kantorovich is calling the law of nations, purely voluntary agreements among nations. But in Blackstone, the first source of the law of nations is the natural law. And Blackstone adds that even with respect to the conventional parts of the law of nations, agreements, customs, traditions between nations, even there, he says, we have no other rule to resort to but the law of nature when it comes to their interpretation. Because the law of nature is the only law to which all communities are equally subject. The second authority that the founders consulted was Aimé de Vattel. And he explains more fully than Blackstone how the law of nations is grounded in the law of nature. his book, The Law of Nations, which came out in 1758, so shortly before the founding, was probably the one most often consulted on this subject during the founding era. And here there's a scholar by the name of Bernard Nadelson who really nails this topic very nicely. But the Law of Nations, also I remembered this, that when I was looking into the curricula of early American colleges and universities, a high percentage of them assigned Vattel's Law of Nations as a fundamental book that all the students had to read. But here I'm going to quote Vattel, and I'm going to quote several passages because they're so striking in regard to showing the tight connection between the reasoning behind the Law of Nations, as Vattel conceived of it, and the founder's political theory and its bearing on foreign policy. So Vattel writes, quote, "All men inherit from nature a perfect liberty and independence of which they cannot be deprived without their own consent. As men, they are subject to the laws of nature, and as their union in civil society cannot have exempted them from the obligations of the law of nature to observe the obligations of the law of nature, since by that union they do not cease to be men. The entire nation, whose common will is but the result of the united wills of the citizens, remains subject to the laws of nature and is bound to respect them in all its proceedings." So you see the logic just exactly like the Declaration of Independence. You start with the equality of individuals, their subjection to the laws of nature, their union in civil society, not exempting them collectively from the duties of the law of nature, so that the society, once constituted, then becomes itself subject to those same laws. I continue. Vattel says, quote, "We must therefore apply to nations the rules of the law of nature in order to discover what their obligations are and what are their rights. Consequently, the law of nations is originally no other than the law of nature applied to nations." Now, Vattel, more explicitly than the founders, than the documents that I've looked at in the founding so far, sums up the ground of the natural law in reasoning about the conditions of human happiness. Quote, "The natural law," he says, "is the science of the laws of nature and of those laws which nature imposes on mankind, or to which they are subject by the very circumstances of their being men. The natural law is a science whose first principle is this axiom of uncontestable truth. Quote, 'The great end of every being endowed with intellect and sentiment is happiness.' Unquote. Now, Vattel continues, "By studying the nature of things, and that of man in particular, we may thence deduce the rules which man must follow in order to attain his great end. The laws of nature are certain, they are sacred, and obligatory on every man possessed of reason, independently of every other consideration than that of his nature, and even though we should suppose him totally ignorant of the existence of a God." Unquote. And from these premises, then, Vattel goes on to deduce the basic rights and duties of nations. Quote, "Nations composed of men and considered as so many free persons living together in the state of nature." So each nation is in the state of nature with other nature, just as individuals in the state of nature are related to each other in the same way. But as so many free persons living together in the state of nature, nations therefore are naturally equal and inherit from nature the same obligations of rights. Power or weakness does not in this respect produce any difference. A dwarf is as much a man as a giant. A person's a person, no matter how small. No, I'd added that. A dwarf is as much a man as a giant. A small republic is no less a sovereign state than the most powerful kingdom. That's Vattel, okay. So the consequence, he says, is, quote, "A nation that is mistress of her own actions, a nation then is mistress of her own actions, so long as they do not affect the proper and perfect right of any other nation." Right, the proper, meaning by that phrase, as long as they don't attack another nation or harm it or threaten to harm it. If a nation makes an ill use of her liberty, and Vattel means in either her internal policy or in warring with other nations, if she makes an ill use of her liberty, she is guilty of a breach of duty, but other nations are bound to acquiesce in her conduct, since they have no right to dictate to her. Vattel hereby anticipates the non-intervention principle of the Declaration, the right of national sovereignty the right to a separate and equal station. And it's on the basis of these same natural law arguments that Vattel concludes that morally just war must be defensive war. And again, I quote, "The consequences of my premises is that if a nation takes up arms when she has received no injury, nor is threatened with any, she undertakes an unjust war. Those alone to whom an injury is done or intended have a right to make war." Unquote, that's Vattel. So now, taking the broader view, what I've tried to show so far in my remarks is that although the founders have sometimes been called realists because of their hard-headed and unapologetic concern with the preservation of America, it is nevertheless true that they were idealists in their sincere attempt to ground foreign policy on principles of justice. Their understanding of the law of nations means that they conceived nations to be bound by genuine moral duties. Here's an example. In an essay arguing for the repayment of the Revolutionary War debts owed to European nations, Hamilton writes, quote, "The established rules of morality and justice are applicable to nations as well as to individuals. That the former as well as the latter are bound to keep their promises." So nations as well as individuals are bound to keep their promises, to fill their engagements, to respect the rights of property, which others have acquired under contracts with them. Without this, in other words, without following the rules of morality and justice, without this, there is an end of all distinct ideas of right or wrong, justice or injustice, in relation to society or government. There then could be no such thing as rights, no such thing as property or liberty. Everything must float on the variable and vague opinions of the governing party of whomsoever composed, unquote. So that's Hamilton's very firm. Once you give up the idea that international relations can be just the realm of immoral or amoral conduct, you're really denying the possibility of any such thing as justice at all. And you could say this is a very remarkable rejection of legal positivism in this formulation. And in other words, in conclusion, of course, we have to pay our debts from the revolution. We cannot say, oh, well, we can't afford it. Now, the reason why, one of the reasons why America has been at war ever since 1941, Cold War or Hot War, is because we have rejected the law of nations. Instead, in the older sense, now we think we have a different view of that now, but instead our relations with other nations are determined by claims such as the following. First, that war anywhere in the world is a threat to the United States. And second, as the manager of the whole world's affairs, America's sphere of interest, as Robert Kagan writes approvingly, is the whole world, right? Our sphere of interest is the whole world. We conduct, and of course, ever since 1941, we've conducted many wars of choice and few wars of defense. The founders' understanding of national sovereignty has been strongly challenged over the past 150 years. Especially by Franklin Roosevelt, and I'll use the example of his Four Freedoms speech to illustrate. The Four Freedoms, and this speech in 1941, are freedom of speech and religion, freedom from want and fear. By the way, the speech given was kind of laying the agenda for the whole purpose of World War II. Right? Again, it's not about national defense. It's about the four freedoms. As he listed each of the four freedoms in this speech, Roosevelt added the phrase, quote, "everywhere in the world," unquote. So the first two freedoms, speech and religion, reaffirm in a truncated way the founders' idea of freedom. But notably, FDR omits the freedom of association, that is personal liberty, and property rights. These had to be sacrificed to the new freedoms, especially freedom from want. Freedom from want meant the adoption of the New Deal welfare state, not only within but outside the United States. Freedom from fear meant the outlawing of war as an instrument of national policy, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which I've already referred to, also everywhere in the world. That meant the world of sovereign independent nations required by the political theory of the founding was to be replaced by a world of only quasi-independent states. The whole world would be supervised by the United Nations, led, of course, by the United States, to impose disarmament and the New Deal everywhere. The United Nations, composed, as Roosevelt claimed, of the peace-loving nations, which included the Soviet Union, would dictate to all other nations their domestic as well as their foreign policies. So that the Declaration's claim that all nations have a right to a separate and equal station and a right to levy war was criminalized by Franklin Roosevelt's approach and treated as a barbaric relic of a bygone age. Instead, as Roosevelt explained in his final State of the Union address, the one supreme objection for the future for all the United Nations can be summed up in one word: security. And that means not only physical security, which provides safety from attacks by aggressors, it means also economic security, social security, moral security in a family of nations. End quote. The United Nations would take charge, war would be abolished, and a second Bill of Rights, which he announces in this same speech, the right to economic well-being, would be established everywhere in the world. Again, that phrase. Franklin Roosevelt's program has informed much of American policy ever since. Its later iterations have been variously called liberal hegemony, that's Stephen Walt's term, Pax Americana, Glenn Deason's term, and the liberal world order, Robert Kagan's term, and more recently, the rules-based international order, President Biden's term. It is true that FDR's agenda was challenged in important ways by some later presidents, notably Nixon, Reagan, and Trump. All three of these wanted to return to something closer to the founders' conception of a world of sovereign nations. But by sailing against the wind, as we now know, these three presidents each came close to being impeached and removed from office. That's how strong the consensus, the FDR consensus, has been. In conclusion, I want to say we don't have to live this way. Yes, we could go back, at least to some degree, and maybe gradually, to the old order. And here I want to refer to the article that was mentioned by Peter in the introduction, my article on Leo Strauss and American foreign policy, in which what I tried to argue there was that Strauss, in important ways, in describing the foreign policy views of the classics and especially of Plato, anticipated the view of the founders in the following way. Foreign policy should be primarily about protection of the homeland for the sake of virtue and excellence in the homeland. That is, for the sake of what the founders would call the blessings of liberty, or in the Massachusetts Constitution, the blessings of life. So the higher meaning, what's the purpose of politics in the first place? Yes, it's protection, but the protection is for what? It's not just life and liberty, it's for the blessings of life and blessings of liberty. It's the good things that come from those things. Politics can't make men happy. Politics can't, in the modern world, at least the founders thought, aim at human happiness and making us all happy in the state-prescribed manner. There were too many religious differences to make that feasible, among other problems. Instead, though, the idea was to establish the conditions of happiness, the conditions of well-being, in the full sense of the word, human completion and perfection, by means of the protection of individual rights at home and abroad. All right, thanks.